I'm Adam Douglas. I'm Senior Specialist here at Peter Harrington, and I wanted to talk about what is a rare or antiquarian book. That's what we sell here, and sometimes people are confused about what they are. Basically, we're trying to sell the first edition or the most important editions of important books. So what makes a rare book rare? You can have the rarest book in the world. There might be 5 copies, but if no one wants to own it or read it, then it doesn't matter. So they have to be important books, and they have to be books that still excite people, sometimes hundreds of years after they've been published. Here's a book which is Boswell's Life of Johnson. That's published in 1791. Here it is with its portrait of Dr. Johnson, one of the key figures of the 18th century. Published in the 18th century. It's not actually that rare. There's 1,250 copies published, and sometimes when you're going around a book fair, it seems like all 1,250 of them are still out there. But people buy this book, people like to read it, people enjoy it, and that is the kind of thing that we're looking for. Now, why do people collect rare books? As the example of Boswell's Life of Johnson shows, it's something to do with an engagement with the book. People get excited about the book, that perhaps they've read it in childhood, or perhaps they've studied it at university, perhaps they're in a line of work where the key author is important to the intellectual history of what they do. For example, this recent generation of .com billionaires shows some interest in science books because that's what they studied. So to them, people like Galileo, Copernicus are their intellectual heroes. So they tend to collect in that area. Not all of them, but that's why some people choose to collect, because of their personal interest. I'm often asked whether books can be considered a good investment. It's a tricky question to answer. Here at Peter Harrington, obviously, we do treat in some ways books as an investment because we buy and sell them and we make a profit doing so. They are a commodity which has some potentially high transaction costs. So if you sell your books at auction, for example, there's a slice of that goes to the auction house. So it's a tricky thing to get. So we don't necessarily advise people build a library purely as an investment. It's better to look at the books at the pleasure of having those books in your library for 10, 20 years. Those are the kind of timescales we're looking at, where you might enjoy owning a first edition. And in the long run, the value of those books is likely to go up. It's an asset class that has shown increased values, but we can't always predict which books that happens to. As I was mentioning with the .com market, we saw science books increasing in value in comparison to other areas that had previously done well. So it's important to consider what you're passionate about, what you want to own, rather than thinking purely about the value of it. So what factors influence the value of a rare book? Well, I think there are 5 things, and I tell my catalogers, my junior catalogers, to keep this in mind when they're cataloging the book. In reverse order, I suppose the most important thing to start with is the edition. Which edition of the book is it? It makes a huge difference to the value. So I've got here, this is the first edition of Darwin's Origin of Species, key book, first book that explains in book length about the theory of evolution, one of the most important books published in the 19th century. So that's the first edition. Here I've got a copy of the second edition, and you can see they're pretty similar, very similar in presentation. They're both in this green cloth published by John Murray, but the difference is in the value. So we have here the first edition, and even though it's had a tiny little bit of repair to the binding, which we'll come on to, the importance of condition, that's priced £195,000. And we've got the second edition here, which actually is in better condition. The cloth is fresher. It's a really lovely copy, but that's only priced at £14,500. So from 195 to 14.5, the drop off from a first edition to a second edition is really sharp. So I mentioned condition. That is the other thing to think about. When people are looking at books, when we're looking at books, and when people who might conceivably buy your books from you later look at books, they're always looking for condition. So we can see here the kind of differences you would be looking for in a book of this date. This is a 19th century book. This is a classic case binding, we call it. It's cloth over fairly thin boards. And the important things are here, this inner hinge sometimes gets damaged. And in fact, this one's just had a little bit of paper repair because it cracked when it was being read. So one always looks at that. You see the back one hasn't been repaired and you can see a crack there. It's not falling apart, but it's cracked. So this one on the second edition, you can see here, if I just open it up, the hinges are really in excellent condition and they haven't been repaired. So that's the kind of thing that collectors pay a premium for, is condition. The third factor is the importance of the book, or the interest of the book, you might think of it as. So there are about, nowadays, between 500,000 and 1 million titles published in English every year. So take 1997, say there were 1 million books published that year. There's only one Harry Potter published that year in 1997. So that's the first edition, the first book in the Harry Potter series. That's by far and away the most valuable book published in that year, because people are still interested in the book. The same is true of Darwin's Origin of Species. 1859 is an iconic year just because this book was published that year. So it's whether people are actually interested in the topic, they're interested in the book as a piece of literature perhaps, or for the intellectual history, and that's particularly important with Darwin. It may be that there's something much more obscure. So here we've got a sweet little book. It's called The Whole Art of Legerdemain. I can never pronounce it, but it's a conjuring book. It's tricks for conjurers, and that's published in 1779. So people are still interested in magic tricks. They're very interested to see 18th century tricks, the kind of tricks they perform. And actually the tricks are remarkably similar to the tricks that modern stage magicians use. So that's where the interest of the book may outweigh its importance. I don't think anybody would argue that's a hugely important book, but it's an interesting book. So we've got the edition, we've got the condition, we've got the importance. We do come to rarity. It does make a difference how rare something is. It may be rare in a particular condition. So the two things play off each other. Here we've got Madame Bovary, which is obviously a famous, perhaps the most, some people regard it as the first modern novel. So here it is in its original wrappers. So these are obviously quite flimsy. So to have it in it's just a simple paper wrapper printed, there's no card in it or anything. So obviously in that condition, that is rare. So the rarity, maybe, but the book is intrinsically rare, it's published in small numbers, but also its survival in the kind of collectible condition that you want also gives it an extra rarity factor. The other one that can sometimes affect a book's value is the provenance. So if the book belonged to somebody who's associated with the author, then you've got an extra value there. So those are the 5 things, and I use a little mnemonic to remind my cataloguers of those. They're provenance, rarity, importance, condition, edition, and that spells out price, and that's how we justify the price that we charge for them. Auction records obviously give you some kind of record of what has been sold over the past years, and you can calculate how inflation runs against that. We also keep an eye on other booksellers, see the kind of copies that they're offering books at, so we get our price information there from our competition. Obviously, at Peter Harrington, we've got quite a database of books we've sold in the past, so we know what kind of level these books will sell at. Also, you can look online and see what books are currently being offered, although there's an important little caveat with that, is that the books that are showing online haven't actually been sold yet. So occasionally booksellers put them out there online with an optimistic price on it, let's say. So I'm often asked about storing and safeguarding books. Obviously, we sell rare books at really substantial values. Some of these books represent a major investment sitting on your shelf. And people ask, is that okay, sitting on the shelf? Well, the simple answer is usually yes. That's the best place for a book, is standing upright on the shelf like the shelves behind me. Not too tight, just standing upright, not leaning over. Some people get tempted, especially if they get a lot of books. They start piling them up and squeezing them in and piling books on top of each other. That's not such a good idea. A straightforward, regular shelf is an excellent way of storing books. by and large. Some of the bigger books, sometimes really big books, sometimes do better lying down horizontally. That's not true of all big books. So books, for example, with lots of hand-colored plates inside it, it's not a good idea to lie it down because you can get offsetting from the plates with the pressure of the weight of other books on top of it. So you need to make sure that if you do lie books sideways, you don't want to put a lot of weight on top. We use several ways of protecting our books. When we have a book in a dust jacket, here's P.G. Wodehouse, an early Jeeves novel, we wrap these dust jackets in a polythene wrapper which keeps the dust jacket, which is relatively fragile and where a lot of the value of the book resides. So we wrap those in a plastic. And all the books that you buy from Peter Harrington, we have that plastic on those dust jackets. And then another way, which is really surprisingly helpful, is a book box or a book case. So this collector's case here belongs obviously to the Darwin first edition of The Origin of Species. And here's the kind of plastic that we would wrap around cloth and dust jacketed books. But this case, which is a folding case, it's lined with a kind of plush material there. It's archivally sound, so it doesn't transfer the color to the book. And when that is closed, it's not exactly entirely 100% airtight, but it will protect the book from things like sprinklers going off or coffee being spilt or even the book being shaken if you have to move it around. Because the book case is a bespoke fitted case for the individual volume, it won't shake around inside the box. In fact, when we're traveling to book fairs, we really make sure that all our books have got this kind of case because it means you can transport it. Even we air freight our books and they all come out in exactly the same condition because they've been in this box. If the box takes the hit, it's an awful lot easier to replace the box than it is the first edition of Darwin's Origin of Species inside it. So the other thing you can do in this room, I don't know whether you can see, the light's quite dim. We don't shine bright lights on books. Usually we try and store the books away from our windows. Obviously we have windows in our shop and we use a UV filter film, which you can buy, which just goes onto your windows. So if you have bookshelves near a window, it's really worth investing in that because it stops the colors fading. It stops the colors of leather fading and of also printed things like a dust jacket where you can see here it's quite red. All the reds are bright everywhere. That's because it's been kept away from light. If that's left out in the sun for a while, that starts to fade to pink. So those are all considerations, but it's not too difficult. People sometimes also ask me about temperature and humidity. And really books do okay in most temperatures or humidities. The best thing though is to keep those even. So if you can keep your books away from heat sources like radiators that fluctuate in heat or away from air conditioning units that are on and off, if you can keep temperature and humidity steady, then you should be fine with that. I'm Adam Douglas, a senior specialist at Peter Harrington. I hope you've got some insight now into the value, the excitement and the passion of rare and antiquarian books.